Hello and welcome to another episode of Life as a Scale Model. Please take a moment if you haven't already and subscribe to the channel and also like this video. It helps us to do better in the algorithm so we can keep bringing you great videos in the future. Thank you so much for your support. Today we're going to be starting with one of my favorite 2500 scale builds, the USS Enterprise NCC 1701B. Why is this one of my favorites? Well, because I really like the Enterprise B. I think she's a good-looking ship. So, we gotta look at the decals. We're gonna look at some of the most egregious things about this particular kit right off the bat. Notice all of those awful grid lines. They are bad. We are going to make them go away. That's going to take a lot of time. It's actually going to be one of the primary things we spend the most time on during this build. I have done this build in the past, and fortunately for, I guess, everybody, including you out there in YouTube viewer land, it's one of the few kits that I've completed that I actually still have laying around. So as a bit of a incentive to keep it coming back to my videos, we'll do a little compare and contrast once I finish this particular iteration of the build. See how my skills have improved, if at all. But yeah, you can see that those raised grid lines make a nasty comeback with this particular kit. This kit was released in 1996. It came out in a 3-piece set that included the Enterprise B, the Enterprise C, and then the new for the time Enterprise E, all on 2500 scale. So yeah, this particular kit is going on 30 years old. I hope that round 2 have plans at some point to do some new toolings on these kits, as I've mentioned in the past, because I think they're great little kits to build, especially for beginners. But they do need a little bit of love. And we'll get into some of the areas that need a little bit of love a little bit later. For now, we're just going to start by clipping the pieces of the saucer out and starting the sanding process. I probably spent the better part of 5 or 6 hours sanding this model during this build. I am also being a little bit more anal retentive about things than maybe you are. So maybe you don't see a need to sand all of the grid lines off and things like that, and that's fine. The important thing at the end of the day when we finish our models is that we, the builder, are happy with the results. And if spending 5 or 6 hours sanding off grid lines from the surface of your model doesn't make you happy, then I recommend you don't do it, because if you don't have a good time, if you don't have fun, then what's even the point of doing the hobby? As I said, I've built this before, so I didn't really feel a need to look at instructions or anything before I dove in. And so once I got everything cleaned up in the sink and got all of the release agents off of the surface of the model, I just jumped in. We're sanding. There will be a lot of that, like I said. It needs to be said as well that as we go up in size, not necessarily in scale, but in size, that the relative complexity of the kits are going to increase as well. That's just a byproduct of having a bigger sized model with more parts in play, and sometimes to get those parts to work together properly, we've got to do complicated things. Don't let it scare you. This build is still absolutely attainable by a relative newcomer to the hobby, but just be aware that you'll be doing some things maybe a little differently than you might have seen in some of my other videos, or that you might expect if you haven't watched any of the other videos that I've done. No spoiler here, but one of the big things you're going to notice about this particular build today is that I'm actually building in subassemblies per the instruction booklet. And there are very good reasons for that we will get to. However, let me just apologize in advance if the video seems a little disjointed. Unfortunately, no amount of planning can truly ready you for a build. Sometimes you just have to get in there and see how the chips are going to fall and just play things by ear with mostly a plan, but not entirely a plan. And that's kind of what I had to do here this week. I had mostly a plan. I knew mostly what I was doing, but there were some fine details I hadn't thought about beforehand that ended up needing to be solved along the way. That's one of the things I actually like about modeling is problem solving and figuring out innovative ways to usually fix my mistakes, but also to basically just do a thing. So yeah, this is going to be a long segment of me just sanding. By the time I got done with this entire sanding and putting together the model process this week, the surface of my desk looked like Tony Montana's desk in that one movie, the Tony Montana movie. I'm not a huge movie guy. Maybe somebody knows the answer to that. I have spaced it. Scarface? If that's right, give me a thumbs up in the comments. I'm pretty sure it's Scarface. Anyway, back to getting on task. So what I'm doing here is I'm using, as you can see, multiple different methods to sand the raised grid lines off of the surface of the model. I'm using my 150 grit sandpaper, and I'm using my diamond tip file, and I'm just working it all in and around all the parts that I want to leave intact. But because the designers of this model really felt like they needed to go above and beyond in creating potential pain for the builders who would eventually build this model, there were also recessed grooves that run in a circular pattern around the saucer here. Back in 1996, I imagine that this approach really made a lot of sense because we didn't have the wonderful wallpaper decals that we enjoy today. It was just paint the thing as best you can and then put the markings on. And so having all of this extra detail molded into the plastic would break up the monotony of the surface of the model. So it did at one point serve a purpose, but it is 2025, and now we have these glorious wallpaper decals that Round 2 have blessed us with, and we can use those to put a whole lot more detail into this model than we could have previously. So I did a whole lot of sanding to get all of those panel lines gone, and now I need to put this little piece in the mix with the saucer. This is kind of an ingenious idea. If you've seen pictures or seen the Enterprise B in Star Trek Generations, which is the movie it comes out of, then you know that the Enterprise B actually has 4 impulse engines across its back end of its saucer. There are 2 in the center where the Excelsior would have them, and then for the refit they got 2 massive impulse engines off to either side of the center mounted engines. And real world reason for that is they needed to be able to do damage to the model without doing damage to the actual model. So they took the model of the Excelsior that they'd made for Star Trek 3, and they added a bunch of stuff where they figured they were going to damage it, and they were able to do damage to the stuff they had just added on, and then later pull all of that broken stuff off and have an intact Excelsior model. But anyway, this whole thing just slots in between the two halves of the saucer. I got it backwards there the first time. And then it just kind of leaves a wide open space there in the back. I checked the other one that I built and found that it was basically the same way. I eventually decided I wasn't super happy with that result, so I did what I could after the fact, just filling it with filler putty to give a face that I could then paint to look like an impulse engine. But if I do this one again in the reasonable near future, I might look at what I could do with some styrene plastic sheets to maybe build in a little bit of extra detail where I want it to go. But you can see here I'm working around with the hobby knife, trying to get some of the flash that had eluded me gone. And now I'm dry fitting the two pieces of the saucer together. It's always important that we dry fit before we glue anything together. If we rush in and glue all of our things together without dry fitting, we may have fitment problems. And once we put the glue down, we're going to have to risk, destroying our progress to get them apart again. And we don't want that. So it's important, like I said, just to do a quick dry fit, make sure everything's going to go together the way you want it. And then once you've ascertained that the pieces do in fact fit together properly, then it is time to pull out your hobby glue, your plastic cement or whatever you use, and get those pieces put together, which is exactly what we're going to do right now with these three pieces. The two halves of the saucer on this kit do actually go together quite a bit better, I think, than in the previous three builds that we've done with the TOS Enterprise, the Refit, and the Enterprise A. Specifically because the bottom half of the saucer doesn't actually meet the top half at the very edges. You could probably see before I started the gluing process that there is actually a lip that runs around the outer edge of the top half of the saucer, and the bottom half just kind of slots in there, and then the top half just kind of cradles the bottom half, as it were. And so it's engineering, and the way it's put together actually makes it really easy to get a good firm fit between those two pieces. So I'm really happy with that. Round 2, once again, has all their copyright information on the underside of the saucer. So if you're planning to build this without painting it, then my recommendation would be to take some fine grit sandpaper and sand all of that copyright information off the inside of the saucer piece there, so that you don't see it peeking through when you're admiring your model kit. Truth be told, it would probably still pass the 2-3 foot test or whatever, but it's just one of those things you wonder, why do we still do that? I would also like to point out, I actually have 3 copies of this model that come from 3 different sources. I've got a copy that I got from the original Cadet Series set that came with the Enterprise B, the Enterprise Refit, and the TOS Enterprise. And then I've got a copy that I got out of the Enterprise Legacy set that has all the Enterprises from the NX-01 through the Enterprise E. And then I've also got the new set that Round 2 released just a couple months ago that has the NX-01, the TOS Enterprise, the Refit Enterprise, and the Enterprise B. The one that I am using currently is the one that I got from the Enterprise Legacy set that came out in 2017. That was the set that I had decided to use from the get-go, and so I'm just following through with the plan, because I've got all of those models put into a box and segregated away from the rest of the stash so that nothing gets lost during the arduous process of doing this project. There are a lot of goodies in there that maybe some of you wish you could see right now, but I promise y'all we're going to get to them. Now see, I did my thing that I said not to do. I found that little curved piece that forms those impulse engines, for some reason it just didn't feel like it was sitting quite right. So I decided to pull things apart and maybe see if I could rework it, fiddle with it, try to get it to lay down a little bit better. Ultimately, I got up after this to look at the other one I'd built and realized, oh, it was sitting exactly the way that it was intended to sit, and gave up on that. But I did want to at least give it a good college try before I threw up my hands and called it good. You can see me putting lots and lots of pressure to get those two halves of that model together, and that's because they actually fit together relatively well. It's a really good, tight fit between those two pieces. And there you have it. We have a fully constructed saucer, sans all of the raised grid lines and whatnot. So now that we have the two halves together, it's time for us to fill some gaps. Like I mentioned in the introduction video to this project, the 2500 scale project, as I call it, I'm trying to build these to look as good as I can get them. I know that they're not going to be to the same kind of wow factor standards that you might get out of, say, the 350 kits, or even the 1000 1400 kits that you get some of the other ships in. These little 2500 scale ships are not really designed for that. These are really good ships for building up and putting on your shelf at the office, or in your personal office at home, or wherever, and you're able to build a lot of them and put them on the shelf together because they're relatively small, and so they don't need a lot of display space. But in my mind, when I decided to undertake this project, I felt like it was still worth my time to try and get some incredible results with these tiny little things, just to see if I could. And so that's ultimately the goal I'm going for. And I figured I'd bring you all along for the ride so that you could learn from my mistakes. And my knowledge and experience, of course, but mostly my mistakes. So here we are. And yeah, I'm anal retentively filling gaps on the Enterprise B saucer so that when I put the model completely together, you don't see all of those nasty seam lines that would pull us out of that illusion that it's a real world spacecraft instead of just a plastic toy. So now that I have put the saucer together, now it's time to sand all of the grid lines off of the star drive section of the ship. And I finally got fed up with using my 150 grit sandpaper, and I stepped up to an 80 grit sandpaper, which is totally fine if you're really impatient like I am and you don't like sitting for hours upon hours upon hours sanding things. It's okay to use a heavier grit. But there's a trick to making it work, and I'm just going to lay that out for you here right now. Every time you step up to a finer grit, or step down to a finer grit, depending on how you want to, see that, always sand perpendicular to the way that you sanded with the previous grit. What that's going to do is it's going to break up those grooves and scratches and things that sandpaper put into that surface of the model, so that when you put your primer and whatnot on there, you won't be able to see all of that scratching and stuff. And if you do your job right, you won't be able to see it at all. If you goof and you don't, maybe aren't quite as diligent with it, then you may see a few here and there. It's no big deal, to be perfectly honest. Work within your skill set. Try to push yourself a little bit, but stay within your skill set. And if you're working on something you don't want to ruin, then maybe practice on something that you don't mind ruining a little bit. But it's pretty easy rule of thumb. As you go from a heavier grit to a lighter grit, just go ahead and sand perpendicular to the previous grit that you used. And if you're patient and thorough, then you should never be able to tell that you sanded anything. It's just that easy, as old Bob Ross would say. To be clear, though, sanding the engineering hull of the Enterprise B is not just that easy. The various elegant curves that draw me to the Enterprise B and make her such a pretty ship, in my opinion, also tend to make it a headache when you're sanding these grid lines off. If you're trying to get them completely sanded off, you're just gonna have to grit and bear it, because as you can see, there are a lot of very complex curvatures and surfaces, and unfortunately all of them have grid lines on them. So like I said, hopefully at some point Round 2's got some plans to update these things and bring them more into the 21st century, and maybe we'll get lucky like they did with the refit Enterprise, and they'll do what they call a smoothie version, where there aren't any more grid lines. I would definitely buy that version of the kit in a heartbeat. Even if I had 100 other copies of the kit sitting around, I'd buy that kit in a heartbeat. Until then, you guys can look to me to find out how to get all these grid things off. For those of you who might be new to the channel and wondering why I'm so obsessive about getting these raised panel lines off of the model kit, it's just a matter of scale for me. If you do the math, each of those grid lines is around a millimeter-ish in height from the surface of the ship. And so if you were to scale it up to real world 1:1 size, then all of a sudden those 1 millimeter grid lines would be about 6.5 feet tall, and the ship would look ridiculous. So I just sand them off because to me they serve no practical purpose. They don't help me get better detail on the model kit, and they do actually make it a little bit harder sometimes to lay down the decals. So it's just my way of preemptively making my life easier when I finally get to the decaling portion of the model build. You can see here I've got multiple different diamond tip files. These are my mini files. They're only maybe about 3.5 inches long. They can get into like every little nook and cranny I could possibly imagine on a tiny model like this. I'm going to mention it here because it's actually a good place to mention, but you can vaguely see some pegs along the back side of that engineering section. They run along the top area there. Speaking of a 30-year-old model mold, I encountered some trouble getting one of the pieces to lay down flat when I had those pegs still on the model. Most of them worked fine, but there was just one that I couldn't quite get to settle into place properly. So I ended up just taking my hobby knife eventually and cutting all those pegs off. If you find yourself doing the same, don't fret. You'll be fine. Just take a deep breath and there's your bravery test. I was curious, so I tried using the version of the kit that I got with the newer set that came out in August, and I had the same problem with the same exact peg. So I don't know if maybe the molds are just getting a little tired, but just be aware if you're gonna build this particular model, you might run into the same problem. Hopefully you don't, but you just might. But yeah, I'm really going at it with these diamond file tips here, or diamond tip files, excuse me. Just trying to get all these grid lines gone. Believe it or not, each segment records in about 16.5 minute portions on my camera, regardless of how much footage I actually shoot. And I ended up with 4 or maybe 5 segments of just sanding the star drive area. So I cut a lot of footage this video, and my goal was to not do that when I started this channel, but somehow I didn't feel like 4.5, 5, maybe 6 hours of me sanding would be terribly entertaining for anybody. So I kept the sanding to a minimum, just so you guys can get an idea of how I did it and what I did specifically in order to achieve the results that I achieved. Because ultimately, I just want you guys to learn in as much detail as I can provide how to build these models to the best of your ability. You can see I've gotten the file in contact with my thumbnail there. My wife likes to jokingly tease me that I go out to my bonus room and I get my model manicure when I use my diamond tip files, because invariably I always get myself on one of my fingers or my thumb, and then it looks like I'm trying to, smooth my fingernails out there. I just get real into it though. I was watching another channel recently that does model building as well. Perhaps you've heard of him, but if not, I highly recommend checking out the channel. It's called Sprues and Brews. I'll link it in the description. But he was talking about some of the mistakes that new modelers make, and one of the ones that he mentioned was getting too caught up in getting to the destination. The new modelers tend to go at things with this vigor, this excitement, but a lot of that also tends to push them towards looking too much at the end result and not enjoying the process of getting there. And as somebody who definitely had a mentality similar to that when I first started, I can wholeheartedly say that that is absolutely a thing that happens. And it's something that I tried to conscientiously avoid doing as I am filming this footage here for the Enterprise B. And it's something that I highly recommend you also try to do. It's great to have a finished model that looks amazing to us, or even, if we don't feel like we achieve amazing, at least looks satisfactory to us. And of course, it's fun to show them off to friends who maybe aren't modelers, who are gonna ooh and ah anyway, regardless of how poorly we think we did. But that's not necessarily the point of the scale modeling. The point is to let ourselves get lost in the process and enjoy the trip, the journey. So if you find yourself getting into a bit of a rush, or you feel like you're focusing too much on getting to a specific point in the build, I'm going to share what Sprues and Brews said we should do in that situation, which is to take a deep breath and step away from the table for a little while. It definitely helps to pull ourselves away for a minute when we start to get too wrapped up in reaching our destination. If we just take a deep breath and take a little break. The minute we get too eager to get to the finish line, that's when we start to make silly, needless mistakes. Modeling is very much about being methodical, being purposeful in the way that we do things, so that we can create something that we can be proud of. So yeah, that was just an interesting bit of maybe philosophical model building advice. But I found it pretty apt for a builder like me who sometimes gets a little lost in the weeds of ADD. And when I'm doing builds for my show, my channel, I definitely find myself like, oh, okay, this is what I need to finish for this video. And sometimes I feel like that can take a little bit of the fun out of it. So I very much tried conscientiously just to enjoy the process this time. And even though it was just a lot of boring sanding and it made my back a bit sore because I was doing so much of it, I still can honestly say I had a really good time with this portion of the build so far. There was definitely a little nostalgia mixed in with that since I've built this one. And it was one of the first I ever built. And I've actually, like I said, still got that one around. It's sitting on my shelf in my bonus room studio area. So now we're doing a coat of primer on the star drive section. As you can see, it's moving around a bit. That was all my fault. I did not secure those things to that little podium very well. Actually, I didn't secure them at all. And after I made the mistake and realized it was too late to go back. So I just figured I'd do my best and see what happened. And it turned out pretty good. Can't complain. You can see they're not moving quite so much. I think they may have gotten a little stuck to the platform there. But I did manage to get them all primed without spraying them off the platform, and then got smart and taped them all down so that I wouldn't have to worry about them falling off. So yeah, I'm keeping my can of spray there about 6 to 7 inches away, and I'm using little U-shape motions as I spray, and as I go one direction off the model, I stop, and then I start it back up, and I go the other direction, and I stop, and I start back up. That'll help keep you from getting little speckles and stuff on the model as you're spraying. So we talked about complexity, and here we go. This is the deflector dish housing. Having a separate deflector dish housing is nothing new. We had a separate deflector dish housing for the Refit Enterprise and the Enterprise A, as well as the TOS Enterprise, and those were still pretty straightforward. This one does come with a bit of a catch, though. and that is that you have to install it inside the two halves of the engineering hull. There are actually two pieces that we have to do that with. This is the first, and then the other is the shuttle bay area that hangs out underneath the engineering hull, in that little, I guess for lack of a better way of putting it, U-shaped hollow area that's in the bottom of the engineering hull. And I actually ended up prepping that before I even started the saucer section. What I did is I cut it off the sprue and got it trimmed pretty well, and then I put some primer, and then I put the base coat, and then I put the gloss lacquer, and then I laid down a decal that's supposed to go on there, and then I put another coat of gloss to seal that decal to the plastic, and then I put a coat of dull coat so that it wouldn't look all shiny and weird. And you'll be able to see that part coming up when we actually put the drive section together. Or here, I totally forgot about this part, sorry guys. That's the decal, and that decal goes on that little piece that is supposed to be a shuttle bay. And that shuttle bay sandwiches between the two halves of the engineering hull. It is possible to put that decal on after you've put the whole model together. So I don't want to scare you away thinking, oh no, I have to build it this way because if I don't, then I won't be able to get that decal on. Well, that's not entirely true. This just makes it a little easier. So, like we do with all our decals, we're just going to use our hobby knife to cut the decal off of the decal sheet. Then we'll take some warm water and we'll get the decal to lift off of the backing paper. And once it's starting to lift off the backing paper, then we will go ahead and slide it onto the piece. And while it's, doing its thing and we're soaking it, we're going to put some microsol on there, and that's going to give us a little bit of wiggle room to move the thing around if we need to. It's also going to help it to adhere to the model a little bit better, and then we'll put some micro set once we've got it in place on there, and that's going to shrink it a little bit and help it conform to whatever curvatures or surface details might be on the kit. And so that's what you're going to see here, is that quick process of putting the decals on. Once I got it all decaled, I realized, oh, I'm still going to need to spray the engineering hull. This could be potentially disastrous. So I had to come up with a way that I could still spray the engineering hull without risking getting paint or whatever on the decal that I already put on. And I would like to think that my solution was pretty ingenious. Let me know in the comments what you think. What I ended up doing is I ended up taking the backing paper that the decal came off of and cutting it to a shape where it would fit over the decal itself, and then I just took a little piece of sticky tack and I tacked it on and pushed it down real good so that there was no gaps. And so I'm using the decal's actual backing paper as a mask to protect the decal from all of the spray that I'm going to have to lay onto the model. I'm not going to tell you how that turned out yet because mostly I don't know. It didn't dawn on me to check it before I made the video, so we are going to find out together in the next video how that turned out. But since it's Schrodinger's decal at this point, I'm going to imagine that it turned out spectacular. But here you can see I put some microsol onto the area of the model where I'm going to lay this decal down. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my brush to slide that decal onto the piece. I don't know if this one was meant to kind of curl around the sides or not, but I did find that it was maybe about a 16th to an eighth of an inch too wide on either side. So once I got the gloss lacquer and the flat lacquer sprayed on there, and before I sandwiched it between the two parts of the engineering hull, what I did is I trimmed a little bit off the sides, and I did that just to make sure that I wouldn't have any problems with it throwing off the fitment of the piece when I put it inside the engineering section. So yeah, just like that. When you lay down a decal, that one was by and large pretty painless. You can see too that that's where the hull for our display stand is going to go. And yeah, it just amazes me that they were able to engineer this little kit the way that they did. Now we're putting the micro set on there. We're just going to use our brush to put down a liberal amount, and that is going to again cause the decal to shrink somewhat and adhere to the surface of the piece a lot better. So now you can see my homemade mask made out of the very backing paper that the decal came off of. I've just got, like I said, little teeny tiny ball of sticky tack holding it in place. And now we're going to button up the two halves of the engineering hull. And I'm looking for some various things here and there before I get started, just to make sure that I'm ready to go, because you're dealing with two different loose pieces in addition to the two sections of the ship that you're trying to sandwich together. Luckily, I'm gluing. If you're not gluing, this could be a lot more difficult. I actually did try this with my newer copy that I got out of the new Enterprise set that just came out with the NX-01 through the Enterprise B, and it was surprisingly challenging to just snap it all together. So glue definitely is a godsend in this particular case. I will say, make sure, it says this on the directions too, but make sure when you're sliding this piece into place that you're putting it below the little shelf pieces that are molded into the sides of the engineering hull on the inside there. Because if you try to put it on the top, it's not going to fit right. And if it doesn't fit right, then the two halves of your engineering section are also not going to fit well, and you're going to have all kinds of problems. So yeah, just make sure you're placing it inside the model properly so that you don't create extra work and headache for yourself. I guess it's kind of hard to see, but I guess I didn't quite get on film the section where I put the deflector housing in there. Once again, glue really helps with that. So if you've got some plastic cement, I highly recommend using it, if anything, just for this particular section, even if you're going to do snap together for the rest of it. And I'm sorry I had to take the thing out of the frame, but I needed to make sure that everything was aligned properly, so that when I go to put that second half on there, I don't break things out of place. And I was having a little trouble getting that deflector housing to sit exactly the way I needed it, so that I could just slide everything together nice and easy. But now that I've got that done, we're going to go ahead and move on to getting that part all buttoned up. While we're waiting for that, I would like to I'd like to mention that no, it's not you. In fact, we aren't doing anything with the nacelles this go round. The reason being, we don't need to. Since we're building in sub-assemblies, we're not gonna get to a part where we need to fiddle with the nacelles this time around. The nacelles, as I was looking at them, they don't get put together before they get put onto the model proper. So I was like, well, if there's no reason for me to worry about putting them anywhere on the model right now, then I guess there's no reason for me to worry about working on them at all. Spoiler alert though, they also have raised grid lines on them that, you know, if you're gonna do it like I am, you're just gonna have to sand them off. So there will be footage of me sanding nacelles probably in the next video. But if you paid attention to the instructions I showed you there at the beginning, you may be aware that putting the nacelles onto the ship is actually like the last step that we do. And a lot of that just has to do with the fact that they attach a specific way that requires you to do it that way. Unlike the other ships we've built, you don't put the nacelles together before you attach them to the ship. They actually attach around the pylon in a way that holds them in place really well. I think probably they did that because, of course, the model's bigger, which means things are heavier, and even though that happens to be the case, if you're familiar with the Enterprise B, things around the warp nacelles can be a little spindly. So I imagine a lot of that just is a byproduct of round 2 trying to make sure that once everything was put together, it would stay together and not break as soon as you breathe wrong in its direction. But yeah, we're making progress. We got everything glued together here. I'm pretty happy with the results, and I'll show you what we ended up with. You can see we've got our pure white base coat. It's kind of shiny right now, but believe me, it will be a lot less shiny once we're done. And so yeah, there we go. I'd also like to give a shout out to my producer who suggested using a different camera angle, and because of that, we are now 1 day without a hair incident. So you're welcome. Thanks for watching. And until next time, happy modeling.